The Akintola family stood as a beacon of respectability in their village. Bamidele, the patriarch, had cultivated not only flourishing yam fields but also a reputation for integrity and discipline. Every year during the yam festival, he was the first to be called to offer a blessing, his name spoken with reverence by young and old alike. The villagers often sought his counsel on matters of farming and family, believing that his wisdom came directly from God. Moreo, his wife, was adored for her warmth and hospitality. She was the woman who nursed sick children back to health with her herbal remedies, organized church fundraisers, and never hesitated to share a meal with a neighbor in need. Her laughter, rich and hearty, echoed across their compound, blending with the rustle of the mango tree leaves that shaded their home. Ade, their eldest son, was the pride of the family. Home from university for the holidays, he often spoke about the modern world and his ambitions of becoming an engineer. Villagers gathered around him in awe, their admiration stoked by the prospect of someone from their small community making it big in the city. Then there was Temi, a spirited 15-year-old who often followed her father to the fields, asking endless questions about the crops and the seasons. She dreamed of becoming a writer, her notebooks brimming with stories and sketches inspired by the world around her. If the family was the village's pride, Temi was its heart, a vibrant, joyful spirit who brought warmth wherever she went. From the outside, the Akintola family seemed untouchable, their home a sanctuary of harmony. But behind the laughter and accolades lay a fragile foundation, one that would soon crack beneath the weight of unspeakable truths. It was a still night, the kind where the world seemed to hold its breath. The soft hum of crickets was interrupted only by the occasional rustle of the mango tree's branches swaying in the breeze. Moreo stirred from her sleep, her senses alert to a faint, unfamiliar sound. It was a muffled cry, barely audible but enough to set her heart racing. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Bamidele, and followed the sound to Temi's room. Through the thin wooden door, she could hear her daughter's quiet sobs. "Temi, are you all right?" Moreo called softly, knocking gently. The sobbing stopped abruptly. "I'm fine, Mama," Temi replied, her voice shaky. "It was just a bad dream." Moreo hesitated. The instinct to comfort her child warred with the sense that Temi wanted to be left alone. Finally she said, "All right, my dear. If you need me, I'm here," before returning to her room. But sleep didn't come easily for Moreo that night. The sound of her daughter's tears haunted her, an uneasy feeling settling in her chest. The next morning Temi was unusually quiet. She barely touched her breakfast and avoided eye contact with anyone, even Ade, who teased her about her somber mood. After breakfast, she retreated to her favorite spot under the mango tree, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Moreo watched her from the kitchen window, her heart heavy with concern. Temi had always been the family's light, her laughter infectious and her curiosity boundless. But now she seemed withdrawn, her vibrant energy replaced by a heavy silence. Moreo wiped her hands on her apron and sighed. "Teenage years," she muttered to herself, trying to dismiss her growing unease. "It's probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing. As the days went on, Temi's behavior became more worrisome. She started spending more and more time under the mango tree, her pen scratching furiously in her notebook. When her family approached her, she would smile faintly and claim she was working on a story. At night, though, her muffled cries returned, barely concealed by the thin walls of the house. One afternoon, Ade found Temi under the mango tree, her notebook open but her gaze distant. "Hey little sis," he said, sitting beside her. "What's going on? You've been so quiet lately." Temi shrugged, her eyes still fixed on the ground. "Nothing. Just thinking." "Thinking about what?" Ade pressed gently. She hesitated before replying. "Just life, I guess." Ade frowned, sensing there was more to her words. "You know you can tell me anything, right? Whatever it is, I'll be here." Temi nodded but didn't say anything else. Ade sighed and ruffled her hair. "All right, but don't forget that, okay?" As Ade walked away, Temi buried her face in her hands. She wanted to tell someone, to let the weight of her secret lift, but the fear of what might happen kept her silent. That night, Moreo decided to speak to Bamidele about her concerns. "Something's wrong with Temi," she said as they prepared for bed. "She's not herself. I think we need to talk to her." Bamidele waved her off. She's a teenager. They're moody. She'll be fine. But she's crying at night, Bamadiel. I hear her. Something is bothering her. Let her cry, he said dismissively. She'll toughen up. Moreo stared at him, a knot of frustration tightening in her chest. You always dismiss things like this, but I'm telling you something is wrong. Bamadiel sighed heavily. Fine. I'll talk to her tomorrow. But I'm telling you, you're making a big deal out of nothing. As he turned off the light, Moreo lay awake staring at the ceiling. She wanted to believe her husband, to believe that her worries were unfounded. But deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. And she was right. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the compound as Ade rummaged through the living room for a pen. Frustrated and running out of options, he noticed Temi's notebook resting on the table under the mango tree. She won't mind, he thought, flipping through its pages to find a blank space for jotting down a phone number. But as he skimmed past her usual sketches and quotes, his hand froze. Scattered between drawings of birds and the sprawling mango tree were haunting, fragmented phrases. He told me to keep quiet. It hurts, but I can't tell Mama. What will happen if they find out? Ade's throat tightened, and a cold wave of nausea swept over him. His heart pounded as he flipped through more pages, each scribbled thought more alarming than the last. Words like fear, shame, and secret leaped out at him, connecting dots he wished he could unsee. Ade tried to tell himself it was a misunderstanding, that maybe Temi was writing a story, but the fear etched into her handwriting made it impossible to deny. Something terrible had happened. Clutching the notebook, Ade stormed toward the mango tree, where Temi was sketching absent-mindedly. Temi, what is this? He demanded, thrusting the notebook into her lap. What are you talking about here? What does this mean? Temi's eyes widened in panic as she grabbed the notebook and held it close to her chest. Nothing. It's nothing, Ade, she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. This isn't nothing. Ade shouted, his voice trembling. What's going on? Who's hurting you? Temi broke down, sobbing uncontrollably as she crumpled to the ground. Ade knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Temi, talk to me, he urged, his voice softening. You can tell me. Please. Through her tears, Temi whispered the words that would shatter Ade's world. It's Papa. He comes into my room at night. The weight of her confession hit Ade like a punch to the chest. His breath caught, and for a moment he felt like the earth had been pulled out from under him. What are you saying, Temi? He asked, his voice barely audible. He tells me to keep quiet, Temi sobbed. He says no one will believe me. That I'll ruin everything. Ade sat frozen, his mind racing. Memories of their father's laughter, his strong hands working the fields, his booming voice echoing through the village. All of it now seemed like a twisted facade. How could the man who had raised them, the man everyone admired, commit such a monstrous act? Temi clutched Ade's arm, her eyes wide with desperation. You can't tell anyone, she pleaded. Please, Ade. What will happen to Mama? To our family? They'll hate me. Ade's heart broke as he looked at his sister, her vibrant spirit crushed under the weight of an unimaginable burden. Temi, he said softly, this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. And you're not ruining anything, he is. Temi shook her head, her tears falling onto the notebook in her lap. Promise me you won't say anything, she whispered. Please, Ade. Ade felt torn in two. Every fiber of his being screamed to confront Bamadiel, to expose the truth and protect Temi. But the terror in her eyes rooted him in place. He nodded reluctantly, his voice heavy with conflict. I promise, Temi. But this isn't over. I'll find a way to fix this. That night Ade lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as waves of anger, disgust, and helplessness washed over him. From the other side of the house, he could hear their father's deep, jovial laughter as he recounted a story to Moreo over dinner. The sound made Ade's stomach churn. How could he act so normal, so untouched by the devastation he had caused? Ade clenched his fists, silently vowing to protect Temi at all costs, even if it meant carrying the burden of her secret. The days that followed were a blur of tension and suppressed rage. Ade avoided Bamadiel as much as possible, his stomach turning every time he saw him. Temi, once lively and full of energy, became increasingly withdrawn, her eyes constantly darting around as though expecting danger at any moment. Moreo noticed the change in her children but misinterpreted it as the usual sibling quarrels. "You two need to stop fighting," she scolded one evening, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. But Ade couldn't keep his anger hidden for long. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, he found himself glaring at his father. Bamidele, oblivious, laughed heartily at one of his own jokes, the sound grating on Ade's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "Is something wrong, Ade?" Bamidele asked, noticing his son's sullen expression. Ade clenched his jaw, his fists tightening under the table. "Nothing, Papa," he muttered, his voice laced with barely concealed contempt. Temi shot him a warning glance, silently begging him to stay quiet. Ade took a deep breath, forcing himself to look away. But the sight of his father, so smug, so self-assured, made his blood boil. After dinner, Ade cornered Temi outside under the mango tree. "We can't keep this a secret," he said urgently. "This isn't right. We have to do something." Temi shook her head frantically. "No, Ade. You promised. If anyone finds out, it'll destroy us. Mama will never forgive me." "Destroy us? Temi, he's the one destroying us." Ade snapped. "How can you sit there and let him get away with this?" Tears filled Temi's eyes as she whispered. "Because I'm scared, Ade. I'm scared of what will happen if the truth comes out." Ade's heart broke as he watched his sister crumble under the weight of her fear. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the darkness that had invaded their family. But how could he do that when the truth was too heavy for either of them to carry alone? That night, as Ade lay in bed, he realized that silence was no longer an option. Something had to change before it was too late. The atmosphere in the Akintola household was suffocating. Ade and Temi were walking on eggshells, their every glance filled with unspoken dread. The weight of their secret grew heavier each day, and Ade felt as though he were suffocating under the pressure. Then one afternoon, a visit from Auntie Beezy brought an unexpected and chilling twist. Auntie Beezy, known for her love of gossip, arrived unannounced, clutching a basket of oranges. She settled into a chair in the living room, her sharp eyes scanning the room as Moreo poured her a cup of tea. "You're Bamidele," Auntie Beezy began, her voice dripping with admiration. "Such a kind man. Always thinking of others." Moreo smiled politely. "He has a good heart," she replied, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. "Oh yes. Just last week, he gave 3 sacks of yams to Ojeki's family," Auntie Beezy continued, stirring her tea. "You know her, the young girl with the braided hair. Such a sweet child. Her father said he didn't even ask for payment. Imagine that, 3 sacks of yams. Such generosity." Ade, who had been silently listening from the doorway, felt his stomach drop. The image of his father as a kind and selfless provider now felt like a cruel facade. He clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep his composure. "That's thoughtful of him," Moreo said cautiously, her smile faltering. "Oh, Bamidele is a rare gem," Auntie Beezy said, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Always looking out for the vulnerable." After Auntie Beezy left, Ade cornered his mother in the kitchen. His voice was low but urgent. "Mama, don't you see? He's using his so-called generosity to hide what he's really doing." Moreo turned sharply to face her son. "Ade, stop this nonsense. You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do," Ade snapped, his voice rising. "And so does Temi. You think his kindness is real? You think it's normal for a man to give away that much without expecting something in return? Wake up, Mama." Moreo's face darkened, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Ade," she whispered, "don't say things you can't take back." But deep down, Moreo felt the first seeds of unease take root. That night, as she lay in bed beside Bamidele, his even breathing filling the room, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The breaking point came late one evening. Ade couldn't keep the secret any longer. As the family sat around the dinner table, his mother noticing his restless glances at Temi, he finally spoke. "Mama," he began, his voice trembling. "I need to tell you something. About Papa." Moreo set down her spoon, her brow furrowing. "What is it, Ade?" "It's about Temi," Ade said. his eyes darting toward his sister. Temi's face turned pale as she froze in her chair. Ade took a deep breath and launched into the story, recounting everything he had discovered in Temi's journal, and the confession she had made to him. At first Moreo laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. Ade, this isn't funny. Why would you say such a terrible thing about your father? But as Ade continued, her laughter faded. When he described the details, the phrases Temi had written, her late-night sobbing, and her fear, Moreo's face turned ashen. She turned to Temi, who sat with tears streaming down her cheeks. Is it true, Temi? Moreo whispered, her voice trembling. Did your father? Temi nodded, unable to meet her mother's gaze. I didn't know how to tell you, Mama, she sobbed. I was scared. Moreo's world shattered. She clutched her chest, gasping for air as the weight of the revelation crushed her. No, she whispered, shaking her head. Not Bamadiel. Not my husband. That night, after putting Temi and Ade to bed, Moreo waited in the living room, her heart pounding as she rehearsed what she would say. When Bamadiel finally came in from the fields, she confronted him. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice steady but cold. Bamadiel raised an eyebrow, sensing the change in her tone. What is it? Moreo stood, her fists clenched at her sides. Temi told me everything, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and anguish. How could you? How could you do this to your own child? Bamadiel's face darkened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then to Moreo's shock, he didn't deny it. Instead, he crossed his arms and sneered. You believe the ramblings of a child over me? Your husband. Don't you dare twist this. Moreo snapped, her voice rising. She's terrified of you, Bamadiel. She's been suffering in silence because of you. You think you can keep hiding behind your image as a good man? Bamadiel's expression turned from anger to desperation. You don't understand, he growled. You think I'd harm my own daughter? You're being ridiculous, Moreo. Ridiculous. Moreo shouted, tears streaming down her face. I've been blind for too long, but no more. I see you for what you are. A monster. Bamadiel stepped closer, towering over her. Careful, woman. You don't know what you're saying. Moreo stood her ground, her voice unwavering. I know exactly what I'm saying. You don't scare me anymore, Bamadiel. You've destroyed this family, and I won't let you hurt us any longer. For the first time in their 22-year marriage, Bamadiel saw defiance in Moreo's eyes. The power he had wielded over his family was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. Without another word, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Moreo sank onto the couch, her body trembling as the weight of her confrontation settled over her. She had finally spoken the truth, but at what cost? The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by a stranger capable of unimaginable cruelty. As the night stretched on, Moreo vowed to protect her children, no matter what. Moreo's decision to bring Temi's journal to the village elders was not taken lightly. She knew the repercussions of exposing her family's secrets in a community that valued reputation above all else. But as she looked at Temi's pale, tear-streaked face, she realized that silence was no longer an option. Her daughter's safety and dignity were worth more than any public judgment. The meeting was held under the sprawling mango tree at the heart of the village, a space typically reserved for joyous celebrations or community decisions. Today, however, the air was heavy with tension. Nearly every villager had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Children clung to their mothers, elders adjusted their seats, and whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. When Bamadiel arrived, his usual air of confidence had been replaced by a defensive stiffness. He scanned the crowd, his eyes narrowing at Moreo, who sat with Ade and Temi at her side. The journal rested on her lap like a loaded weapon. The eldest of the village elders, Baba Kofi, raised his hand for silence. His deep, gravelly voice carried over the murmurs. We are here because Moreo Akintola has brought serious accusations against her husband, Bamadiel. This matter must be heard and resolved with wisdom and fairness. Bamadiel stood abruptly, his voice booming. This is madness. My own wife and children conspiring against me? How dare they drag my name through the mud like this? I am the provider for this family, the one who has given everything to this village. His words stirred a few nods of agreement from the crowd, but the majority remained silent, their gazes shifting uneasily between him and his family. Moreo stood, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I am not here to destroy you, Bamadil. I am here to protect my children. I have stayed silent for too long, but I can no longer ignore what you have done to Temi. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Temi rose, clutching her notebook to her chest. Her legs trembled, but Ade placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Tell them, Temi, he urged gently. With a deep breath, Temi stepped forward. Her voice wavered, but she spoke clearly, recounting the horrors she had endured. She read excerpts from her journal, her words painting a vivid picture of the fear and pain she had lived with. The villagers listened in stunned silence. Some covered their mouths in shock, while others glared at Bamadil with open disdain. Auntie Beezy, who had once praised Bamadil's generosity, now shook her head, muttering, I should have known something wasn't right. When Temi finished, the silence was deafening. Bamadil stood, his face red with anger. Lies, he shouted, his voice cracking. This is a coordinated attack to ruin me. She's just a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying. But Baba Kofi raised his hand again, silencing him. Enough, Bamadil. The child's words are not to be dismissed. And the journal, he gestured toward the notebook in Moreo's hands, is a powerful testament. Do you deny the accusations outright? Bamadil's mouth opened, but no words came out. The villagers waited, their judgment hanging in the air. Finally, he lowered his gaze, muttering, This is a disgraceful farce. Baba Kofi turned to the elders, who conferred in low voices. After a tense few minutes, he addressed the crowd. Bamadil Akintola, you are to leave this village until a formal investigation is completed. You have brought shame upon your family, and betrayed the trust of this community. Your presence is no longer welcome here. The villagers murmured their agreement, and Bamadil's shoulders slumped in defeat. His departure was swift and unceremonious, marked only by the sound of his footsteps as he left the gathering. In the days that followed, the Akintolas found themselves navigating a new, uneasy reality. The village, once a place of warmth and familiarity, now felt alien. Everywhere they went, they were met with whispers and sidelong glances. Some villagers praised Moreo for her bravery. Auntie Beezy stopped by with a pot of soup and an encouraging word. You did the right thing, my dear, she said, squeezing Moreo's hand. Your children will thank you for it one day. But not everyone was so supportive. A group of women at the market openly blamed Moreo for the scandal. She should have handled it privately, one muttered. Now the whole village is paying for her family's disgrace. Ade bristled with anger every time he overheard such comments, but Temi was the one who suffered the most. The once vibrant teenager avoided school, terrified of the whispers and stares from her classmates. When she did venture out, she kept her head down, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Ade took on the role of her protector, walking her to and from school and shielding her from cruel remarks. Don't listen to them, he told her one afternoon as they sat beneath the mango tree. They don't know the truth. You're the bravest person I know. Moreo, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild her life. She filed for separation from Bamadil, a move that shocked the more traditional villagers. A woman without her husband is nothing, one elder told her. But Moreo held her head high, refusing to let their judgment deter her. The family's once thriving farm began to falter without Bamadil's management. Moreo and Ade worked tirelessly to keep it afloat, but the financial strain was evident. Despite this, they found solace in each other, drawing strength from their shared determination to heal. One evening, as the sun set over the village, Moreo gathered her children in the living room. We've been through a storm, she said, her voice steady. But storms don't last forever. We're still here and we have each other. That's what matters. Her words brought a flicker of hope to the family. They were far from whole, but for the first time in weeks, they felt a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness. For years, Moreo had lived in the shadows of her husband's authority, her voice subdued by tradition and fear. But the confrontation with Bamadil, and the strength it took to expose his sins, awakened something within her. She was no longer the silent bystander in her own life. She was a mother, a protector, and now, an advocate for her children and herself. In the weeks following Bamadil's departure, Moreo learned about a women's support group in the neighboring town. The meetings were held in a modest community center, where survivors of abuse and injustice came together to share their stories. It was there that Moreo met women who had faced horrors like hers, some worse, some eerily similar. At first, she listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap as the other women spoke of their struggles and triumphs. But over time, she found the courage to share her own story. "For so long, I believed staying silent was the only way to protect my family," she admitted during one session. "But silence nearly destroyed us. Speaking out saved my daughter, and it saved me." The group became a sanctuary for Moreo, a place where she could draw strength from others who had reclaimed their lives. With their encouragement, she filed for divorce, a move that sent shockwaves through the village. Many elders condemned her decision, calling it a betrayal of tradition. But Moreo stood firm, knowing that her dignity and her children's safety were worth more than societal approval. She began to advocate for survivors of abuse, speaking at gatherings and visiting neighboring villages to encourage women to break free from their silence. Her words were met with mixed reactions. Some women clung to their silence out of fear, while others found hope in her story. "Your courage gives me courage," one woman told her after a meeting. Back at home, Temi began her own journey of healing. Therapy sessions were tough at first. Revisiting her trauma felt like reopening a wound. But over time, her therapist helped her transform that pain into something constructive. Through her art, Temi began to process her emotions. Her early drawings were dark and stormy, reflecting the turmoil within her. But slowly, bright colors began to seep into her sketches. Rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, birds taking flight, and serene landscapes that spoke of hope and renewal. Moreo encouraged Temi's artistic pursuits, setting up a small corner in their modest home as her art space. "This is yours," Moreo said one evening, running her hand over a freshly painted easel. "A place where you can create, dream, and heal." Ade, too, was deeply impacted by his family's ordeal. Watching his mother's resilience and his sister's courage lit a fire within him. He decided to change his course of study at university, switching from engineering to law. "I want to fight for justice," he told his mother one evening as they sat under the mango tree. "For people like Temi who need someone to stand up for them." The family worked together to rebuild their lives. Ade took on part-time jobs to support their finances, while Moreo expanded her reach as an advocate. Temi's art began to gain recognition, with a local gallery displaying some of her work. For the first time in years, the Akintola family felt the glimmer of a future unshackled by Bamadiel's shadow. Years later, the mango tree that had witnessed so much pain and turmoil now stood as a symbol of resilience. Its roots were deeper, its branches stretched wider, and its shade provided comfort to a family that had endured more than their share of storms. Temi, now a confident young woman in her 20s, returned to the village as a guest speaker at a community event about overcoming trauma. She stood on a small stage under the very mango tree that had been her refuge as a child. Her voice, once timid and shaky, was now strong and steady. "For years I believed my voice didn't matter," she told the crowd. "But I've learned that silence only gives power to those who hurt us. Speaking up saved my life, and it can save others too." Moreo sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter inspire the crowd. Ade stood beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around Ya, who had grown into a bright and curious teenager. After the event, villagers approached the Akintola family with words of admiration and support. Even those who had once judged Moreo and her children now saw them in a new light. Their story was no longer one of scandal but of resilience and hope. As the sun set over the village, casting a golden glow on the mango tree, the Akintolas gathered beneath its branches. They were no longer the perfect family the village had once admired, but they were whole. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, truth, and unyielding love. "We've come a long way," Moreo said softly, her voice filled with pride. "And we're just getting started," Temi replied, a smile spreading across her face. The Akintolas were no longer defined by the shadows of their past, but by the strength they found in each other, and the light they carried into the future.